It would be my pleasure to welcome our keynote speaker, Justin Bean. Quick note about Justin. Justin is an impact-focused tech executive who has worked for Fortune 500s, Silicon Valley startups and non-profit organizations to achieve triple bottom line, both people, plant and profit results as an entrepreneur, consultant, mentor and thought leader. He's the author of What Could Go Right? Designing Our Ideal Future to Emerge the Critical Crisis to a Thriving World. He has authored more syndicated articles and has been interviewed by the New York Times, Forbes, The Hill, Fast Company, Big Think, NBC, South China, Morning Post and others on topics ranging from smart cities, sustainable technology, AI, IoT and industry solutions to combat COVID-19 pandemics, climate change and other social issues. Quickly, what could go right designing our ideal future to emerge from the continual crisis to a thriving world? With all the doom and gloom surrounded us in the news and other stories of the future, it's not easy to feel hopeful about the future. But we will live in one of the most empowered times in human history to rise to the environmental and social challenges that we face and realise immense opportunity in the meantime to thrive like never before. By envisioning what could go right, we can give ourselves a world to work towards, leveraging tech and social trends to find opportunity and help to achieve a sustainable and ethical world. Please welcome Justin Bean.
Thank you so much, Don. Thank you. I know we really gave you a mouthful there with the intro, so thanks for pulling that off. And what a beautiful welcome today, and welcome from the mayor as well. And Mike, thank you so much for running all of this, and especially to everyone in the room who's going to be a part of building this better future. I think Marcus said something really important, which was that we don't know exactly how we're going to get there, but we know we need to, and we know we want to. And so a lot of the work that I focus on is about envisioning what that future is and what that world is that we really want to build. I think especially in the climate tech area and the community, we can get so focused on what's going wrong and how terrible the world seems to be, and all of the fear and the doom and gloom. That doesn't mean we don't have immense challenges, but without knowing where we want to go and without building a plan to get there and a roadmap, it's going to be very difficult to get there, and let alone collaborate across countries, across communities. And so that part is just so important. So let me dive in here and talk a little bit about, a little bit about my background, and then how we might envision what could go right, and already what is going right around us, that we have we've got a lot of reason to be grateful and thankful and excited about the future. Right. So all about what could go right, like I mentioned. So let me start with a little bit about myself. As mentioned, I've worked for some nonprofits, started out working on social projects in the US with the likes of AmeriCorps, Boys and Girls Clubs, projects with Habitat for Humanity, and then Silicon Valley Leadership Group, building policies that help advance a sustainable future. Also have lived and worked in Japan and South Africa, been to a beautiful country called New Zealand and got to enjoy your beautiful country, food, people, and even got to meet some lovely Kias on the South Island. And that was quite a highlight of the trip. Those guys have lots of character. And also some education with INSEAD in France, Stanford University, and then working with Berkeley, also in the Bay Area. And as mentioned, working with Fortune 500s and Silicon Valley startups to really scale these up and think about the details of how we get from 0 to 1 and growing things from ideas into businesses and then scaling them up into larger and more successful businesses that are focused on impact. And across all of these journeys, I really started thinking, you know what, back in my hometown, a lot of people just didn't have exposure to everything that was going on. When I'm at the Thanksgiving table or Christmas table with family or visiting friends, often people are so focused on the headlines and everything that's going wrong in the world, but they weren't getting a chance to see inside of these boardrooms and inside of these conversations and really seeing the progress that's happening with entrepreneurs and with corporates and with people out there really leading. And so I wanted to put together a book that not only shared some of that progress, but some of the how we get there and how people envision the future and how we might do that together to really get to the place where we want to be. And so I'm going to go over 4 questions here that I have for you, and that we can come to together. And like said, please leave questions in the app, and we'll address those a bit later. But first, why should we ask what could go right? This isn't about Pollyanna optimism and just thinking about a better future. It's really about something tactical and tangible and methodic. So 2, are we really in a collapse? If you read the headlines, you would think the world is just falling apart everywhere and we're all doomed. Why have children? Why move forward in life? It's so depressing. But let's take a look at that. And then 3rd, what's the opportunity in this? Because there's a lot of it. There's a lot of it across the spectrum for everyday people working at companies, for entrepreneurs, for big companies wanting to make an impact and grow as a company and get into faster growing markets. And then 4, where might this all be heading and how can we direct it to a better place? So let's start by the big question. Why should we ask what could go right? Now, when I started looking into, how we might ask what could go right and looking at ideal futures and what the future might be, what do you think I ran into? Well, probably a lot of what everyone here runs into when we think about the future. We see Terminator robots stepping on human skulls, right? Very dystopian futures, cataclysms wiping out human cities, destroying all of our friends, families, communities, and the nature around us. Or we see these dystopian futures of authoritarian governments taking over because of a change or because of an issue that comes up, and people waiting in bread lines and living these desperate lives. I mean, this is just preposterous, right? Like, who wants to live in this future? Who wants to be a part of this? Now, this isn't to say that there aren't real challenges, but if this is all that we think the future can be, where are we going and how can we direct ourselves to really get to that better future? So instead, I wanted to take a look at utopian stories. What are some stories that really looked at what the future might be, how good it might work out if we do it right? And guess what I also found? Not only did these give us some great roadmaps of futures that we might want to live in and inspiration of what it might feel like to live there, but it gives us really tangible ideas of things that we might want to build. If we think about Star Trek and some of the more utopian stories, a lot of the technologies and inventions that we see around us today actually have come from people seeing these utopian examples of what the future might be, and then choosing something to focus on, choosing something to work on. You remember the wireless communicators have turned into cell phones. Replicators, not quite there yet, but 3D printers are getting started and we're moving along there. We're doing this today. I'm broadcasting to you today from San Diego, California, halfway across the world. It's very sunny and warm. Sorry to hear it was a little gloomy today in Wellington, but it's great here. And we just take this for granted now that we can talk face-to-face around the world. This wasn't the case just a short time ago. Medical scanning has come a long way, especially with real-time fMRI scans. Universal translators, so easy to use, so ubiquitous in the world around us. Needle-free injections, tablet computers, non-lethal phasers or tasers. I actually saw the CEO of Taser speak one time, and he said that he was inspired by the phasers that he saw in Star Trek, where we could have a non-lethal option for detaining criminals and stopping people from committing crimes that didn't have to be a bullet. And that's a really humanitarian cause, and one that led him to the inspiration to really start this company and get it moving. So this is what enables us to really get into a zone of creativity. Because the neuroscience also says that when we are focused on dystopia, when we're fearful, when we're stressed, we really lose, give or take, about 30% of the ability to focus and come up with ideas and be creative and really get there. We can get out of a dangerous situation quickly, but it doesn't help us to create. So when we're in these safe and playful mindsets of creativity, especially when we're thinking about ideal futures and utopian futures, this can give us more drive, especially over longer periods of time, more inspiration to build what we see and build what we imagine. And then new connections are formed in our brains when we're putting these things together and thinking about how they fit, how they work together, and how we might leverage them for our future. So again, this isn't just Pollyanna optimism. This isn't just about positive thinking. This is about taking a pragmatic approach to envisioning a better future and then building a roadmap to get there. So what's a tool that's used to harness this type of thinking? Well, design thinking is one that is widely used across the world in business and startups to come up with new business ideas, new products, and even new business models and new systems. And what I think is really important about this is that we start with what's desirable. So what is it that people really want, right? We start with a brainstorming session, if you will, and we diverge to create many, many new options that are fantastical, completely impossible, but would meet the actual need. And then we diverge or we converge into feasibility. So after we get a big list of all of the different possibilities that would actually solve the problem, we then start thinking, okay, what's actually technologically feasible? And how can we narrow that list down to things that we can actually build? And then we converge even more into what is actually viable from a business standpoint. And so what can we actually build a business model around that can make money? And so a lot of this is about using the power of business and the capitalist economy that the globe operates on to actually solve these problems. There's a lot of criticism of companies, and some of it is very well intentioned and accurate. But if we were able to convert the system of business around the world into creating sustainable solutions and solutions to our climate challenges and to our social challenges, we can get there so much faster. And so really what this does is not only give us a larger solution set when we start with what's desirable and start with the ideal, it gives us more once we start narrowing it down to what's feasible and viable so that we can capture ideas that we wouldn't have if we started with what would actually make money or what can we actually build technologically today. So starting with the ideal, whether you're building a product or a company or thinking about the future, is a great way to go. Now, some people aren't into this. Some people enjoy other parts of the process, and that's okay. There's a framework by a company called Simply 5 called the 5 Dynamics Framework. And what this does is it looks at what energizes people, what part of the creation process do people get really excited about. And so some people really love exploration. They love new ideas, they love connecting the dots, and they get energized by that. Some people love to excite other people. These are kind of the cheerleaders of the room they're there for the relationships and there to get people excited. There are people who examine. These are often engineers who like to take things apart, figure out what could go wrong. What are all the reasons that this could fail and how can we avoid that risk? Really important to have. And then people who just love to execute. They love to tick off the boxes and get through and really just get things done. Now, this can create a lot of tension, especially between people like explorers who love these ideas and people who are examiners who really just want to narrow it down to what's really possible and what's low risk. But once we see that everyone plays a role in this process, and we all have different parts of this, we all have a little bit of examine or excite or explore and a lot of one or the other. But when we build a team of people that are mixed and have different backgrounds and different ways of looking at the world and get excited about different things, this diversity really is a strength and helps us to build better teams, which build better companies, which build better businesses and build better products. So this is important from the human aspect to make sure that everybody is in the room and that we're being really inclusive in the way that we think about this. So let's move on to one of the big questions of our time. Are we really in a collapse or is this a transition? So if you were to read the news, you would think that, things like poverty and sickness and war and, all kinds of things are just getting worse. Crime out the roof, right? But really, when we look at the statistics and we zoom out a little bit, right, a lot of these trends are actually pretty narrow. They're a couple of years or maybe a decade at most. But really, when we zoom out and see what all of our ancestors have accomplished in the last 100 plus years, or even 200 years in this case, it's incredible what we've done. So extreme poverty, 94% of humanity used to live in extreme poverty. Back in 2015, this was down to 10%, and it's down even lower now. This is similar across the board. Child mortality used to be 41%. That's a tragedy for every family out there. And now it's down to 4%. Still an enormous tragedy, but for 10 times fewer people. And then we look at the things that are getting better, that were good and getting more widespread, like basic education. Only 17% of the world had basic education back in 1820. And now that's up to about 86%. There's still a ways to go, but we've come so far. And I think it's important for us to remember. Same thing with literacy, up from 12 to 85. Democracy began spreading around the world. It went down a bit in World War II, but has come back up and is on the rise. So people are having more of a say in what's going on in the world around them. Vaccinations didn't even exist. And now they're so widespread that we've eradicated diseases that used to just drop us around the world. And now we can have a vaccination that just gets us not even worrying about this. We can focus on other things. And I think this is something that we'll see more and more of moving forward. And one of the problems here is that our perceptions are actually diverging from reality. So when you look at violent crime rates around the world over the last 40 years, there was a big spike in the 80s and 90s, especially in Western countries. But that's come down about 80%. There is an uptick recently over the last few years in some places. But if you ask people what they think the violent crime rate is and how dangerous the world is, what do you think they say? They think it's going up? Do they think it's going down? People think it's more dangerous than ever when we live in a world where it's actually safer than it's ever been for most people. And fewer people die from things like warfare and from interpersonal crime. And so when we look across the board, all of these metrics tell us that the world is actually becoming a better place. Now, there's one area that I'm sure everyone in the room is saying, but what about this? And it's completely true. Our generation's challenge, now that we've tackled a lot of the abundance issues and the educational issues that our forebears were able to tackle, is now to figure out, how do we tackle climate change? How do we respect the ecosystems that we depend on, that surround us, and our brothers and sisters and cousins of the animal and plant communities that we came from, millions of years ago. And this is a reality. This is something that is really difficult to solve, but it's something that we need to work on, and it's our generation's challenge. Now, there ends up being pushback sometimes, and people say, well, it's not actually human created. It's the sun. It's not actually this. Clean transportation and EVs. And there's usually some kind of talking point that is usually inaccurate about these sustainable solutions for the future. But I think it's good to remember that, one, most of those are just being spread by people who have an interest in not getting change in the world. But two, there are so many other benefits of all of the technology and the changes that we're talking about with clean energy, with sustainable supply chains and businesses, and doing things in a way that is ethical and sustainable. This means healthier cities, not spewing toxic gas in the faces of our children when they walk through cities. It means more jobs, faster growth, and better ecosystems, a whole number of things, including stronger economies, which I'll get into a little bit later. And so the way that I'd like to frame this, and the way that I think the Center for Systems Studies does a really good job of, is looking at this in terms of a transition. So if we think about how things are changing over time and the strategic fit for some type of solution or business, we call that the first horizon. So this is something that's business as usual that we continue to do, but it's kind of losing its fit for purpose. We know it doesn't work that well anymore, and we know it's kind of dying out. There may be some things worth conserving in the end, but for now, we know that we need to transition. And what we can see with the third horizon are pockets of the ideal future today. We can see this starting to emerge. We see solar panels and wind power and wave power and all kinds of ways of powering the world, and also more sustainable materials and products and services. So that viable future is within our imagery, but we don't quite know how to get there yet. And that's where the second horizon comes in. And so this is really about transformative innovation that is an explosion of new innovation and creating new solutions for some of these challenges. And what we find ourselves in today, in my opinion, and in the opinion of Anthony Hodgson and Gerald Midgley, who did this research, is that we're in a transition zone. This is the middle space and the in-between space where this first horizon and third horizon are sort of battling it out. And they're trying to figure out how we transition from one to the other, There are a lot of vested interests in the first horizon that are clawing and scratching to keep their place in the world, and a lot of new entrepreneurs that are trying to disrupt and trying to create a better and more viable and superior future. So let's look at this through an example of the renewable energy transition. So we can think of our carbon dominant world today and the economy that we live on basically being a giant oil party, right? We discovered this highly energy dense resource that allowed us to create incredible abundance in the world around us. But we're living beyond the natural limits of our world. We know that it now causes all kinds of health problems. It's causing climate change. And this is something that we need to change. We all know this in this room. We can look forward to a new abundance, and we can sort of imagine a world where we have really viable sustainability or sustainable abundance. And this is about using the energy as it comes in, having energy efficient products and transportation and processes for manufacturing, all of the above. But we know right now that we're in this messy mix right in the middle. And this is where the short versus long-term solutions and worlds are kind of in conflict. And so we see this in the world around us. But I think this way of looking at it actually gives us a bit of hope, because if we just look at the first horizon, we think things are in collapse. Things are going down the drain. There's nothing to save here. But when we actually look at these green sprouts of all this innovation and all of the great things happening around us, we can not only see that better world that's coming, but we can see that this is where we're sort of battling it out to build that future, and where we can add our weight and add our expertise and add our help to really build it. Another model that I think is really helpful is the donut economics model. And so this combines the ecological ceiling or the ecological limits with the social foundation. So we have to work within this space where we can't live in a world where there's not enough for people and we live in complete austerity. That's a shortfall from a social foundation. And then when we think about the ecological ceiling, we need to not go into overshoot, because that's going to collapse our world. And so this is a great model for thinking about policy and how we set the limits of our industry and of our social programs to make sure that we're providing enough for people, but staying within the ecological ceiling. I think there's also another way of looking at this, which is how do we thicken this donut in the middle? And this is about innovation, and this is about entrepreneurship and creating new ways of doing things that keep us within that donut, but actually make more abundance within it. So it's not just about limiting our lives, it's creating more abundance for our lives in a way that's sustainable and in a way that's ethical, and so that we can really get there. And this is a fantastic model by Kate Raworth. If you haven't read Donut Economics, check it out. It's a beautiful way of thinking about it and thinking about how innovation can really lend its credence to building this better world. So we know that there is a potential better world out there. We know that there's a lot of green sprouts of innovation, and that it's actually getting better in some really important ways. But what's the opportunity for us, and how do we get started, and where might we think about getting involved? Well, coming from Silicon Valley, there are a ton of startups focusing on climate tech. In fact, we've seen a lot of famous investors talk about this. So Chris Sacca, one of the people you see on Shark Tank, billionaire investor, thinks this climate tech opportunity is almost unfair, especially with all of the government money coming in, all of the social changes and people shifting over to it. He thinks this is an area ripe for investment, and he's putting his money here more than anywhere else. BlackRock CEO Larry Fink, right, one of the biggest investment firms in the world, said that he thinks the next 1,000 unicorns or billion-dollar startups are going to be in climate tech. So these people look at these startups every day, they look across the economy, and this is where they see the opportunity. They know that, one, there's a major problem to be solved. Two, there are so many new innovations and creative people and entrepreneurs out there trying to solve the problem. And three, that governments are getting on board. Governments are really helping to not only set the limits, but actually funnel real money into this. And we're seeing a lot of that support this economy and make these startups more likely to succeed. But it's not just that, it's also the big corporates. And so this was a study done by Boston Consulting Group, one of the top 4 consulting groups in the world, and they looked at total societal impact. Now, traditionally, companies think about shareholder value and profitability and their corporate longevity in one area, and then social responsibility is something that's kind of a donation bin or a philanthropic pursuit. But instead, companies are starting to integrate it and think about their societal impact as part of their business. And how can they gear their business towards making more social impact? And so what BCG found was actually that the companies who did this and they integrated total societal impact and environmental impact in the core of their business, not just as a marketing campaign, not just as a side hustle, and not just as a philanthropic donation. This was incorporating it into their real business. These companies performed the highest, not only in social impact, but in total shareholder returns. So these companies were performing better. They had higher profitability and margins. They had higher multiples and valuations. They were getting into new markets. This shift was spurring innovation within their companies. It was reducing some of their costs and a lot of the risks on supply chains. We saw this with COVID, with a lot of the lack of resiliency. And so rethinking this in terms of sustainability and social impacts really impacts the resiliency of the supply chain. So reducing risk for these corporates as well, and also improves the brand. People stay for longer. It's easier to recruit. All of these benefits. And another study with BCG and our World Economic Forum found many similar things. So better hiring, higher revenues, but also things like cheaper financing. They were able to acquire financing at lower rates. They had lower regulatory risks. But one thing I think is really exciting here is that if you look at the chart on the bottom, the light blue are the green alternatives to conventional products. And the dark blue are the conventional products, the things that we use every day. But the growth in these markets is incredibly different. So the green alternatives are growing so much faster across the board, whether we're talking about energy or chemicals or food or automotive, packaged goods or power anyway. So these are areas where if you're looking for a career opportunity, if you're looking to start a business as an entrepreneur or shift the company that you work for into more sustainable markets, this is an area where you can find much more success and faster rates of growth. Now, I think something really interesting is happening here. If anybody remembers this, this is called the evolution of the desk. And this is all about the digital revolution. Not so long ago, software ate the world, right? And all of these products and services that we got used to being in the physical world, things like bulletin boards and fax machines and Rolodexes and global maps and all of our pictures that we hung up on our desk, all of these things were companies supporting a business that created these physical things with often unsustainable materials and were using more material from the earth. That's been heavily disrupted, as we all know. We've got so many applications and websites that do the work of these physical things and now do it with software. It used to be on our laptop, now it's on our phone, and starting to shift into things like AR and VR, as we saw with Apple coming out with their AR and mixed reality visor. So I think there's something really similar happening here. So the digital revolution turned everything digital. And I think what's happening today is the sustainability revolution. And so just like this, all of the things in our economy are being systematically replaced with sustainable alternatives. And so we can see this across energy, for example. So energy prices are dropping rapidly. I've still heard people say, oh, you know what, solar's never going to make sense because it's too expensive and it's not cheap enough. And then you look at a chart like this and you see across the world that solar prices have dropped dramatically and are still falling very quickly. So most of them are within the range of fossil fuels. There are some like geothermal and others that are still getting there, but are getting cheaper and cheaper by the day. And this has beat all expectations. All of these little horizontal lines that you see were someone's projection of how quickly solar could grow and how quickly it would scale. But in reality, this red line shows us the actual growth. And so that has outpaced any of the outlooks and projections that have been made. Now, it's still not what we need to stay at 1.5, and I think 1.5 is going to be really difficult, if not impossible, for us to actually get to. But I think with all of the innovation that we're seeing and all of the solutions coming out, that we can start reversing that trend over a period of time and avoid the worst and actually live better than ever. So let's look at a little bit more data. So if we look at this chart, this is the number of deals and the deal value going into climate tech from venture capitalists. So these are the people funding the companies of the future. As you can see, it's up and to the right. And these are operating in enormous markets. If we look at the circular economy, McKinsey estimates that's a $3.5 trillion market by 2030. Renewables, $1 trillion, growing faster, I would bet. Green tech and sustainability, so software and all kinds of solutions, 75 billion. Impact investing was 1.16 trillion in 2022. So there is capital looking for this. There is risk looking for this as an investment risk. And there are companies looking to do this and plenty of people looking to get into this world. So many young people, after I give a talk or they hear a podcast that I do, they contact me and say, how can I get into this? How can I make my career something about sustainability and be a part of this? So this is a generational shift and a social shift as well. So we've got so much momentum going in this area. But here's a little bit of bad news. So last year, there was a 3% decline in the amount of climate tech funding. So this was for 2022, and this was after a record year of investing after COVID. But then if we look at the overall venture capital funding in 2022, it went down 35%. So this was actually one of the best performing investments out there. And these companies were getting a lot of support and surviving a lot better than their conventional counterparts. Now, last year, we see similar trends with auto sales. So auto sales declined about 8%. I want everybody to take a quick guess what they think the change in EV sales was last year. So overall, all auto sales went down by about 8%. How much do you think the EV sales changed in the market? And I can't hear everybody, but I'll just let you guess in your head. It was up 65% in the same year that we saw a decrease in overall auto sales. This is an enormous shift. So whether we're looking at startups being funded, we're looking at clean transportation, across the board, these things are moving in the right direction. If you look at China, that's over 115% growth. So there is an enormous change happening. And guess what? It's diversifying. So when we talked about climate tech 10 years ago, it used to only be energy and transportation. And now things like food and land use or ag tech, industry and manufacturing, climate management, carbon credits, built environment, buildings, everything else, cement, steel, everyone's coming after this market. And so there's an incredible amount of innovation coming in here. And guess what? Investing in that is democratizing. So the ability of people to actually crowdfund and invest in these companies is growing. And I think not only is that a great opportunity, this is not investment advice, but it's an interesting trend. But I think it's really interesting when we're looking at this from a social standpoint, because what we're seeing is, one, the ability for not only startups and companies to raise more capital, especially ones that are climate tech or founded by non-traditional entrepreneurs, women and people of color, they're able to access much more funding because of this. And also, there's such a proliferation of new tools and platforms to create, and not only to create digital things, but physical things. You look at things like ChatGPT that we now take for granted. We can just, enter in a sentence, and it'll create a new image for us, or a video, or give us an entire paper on something. And what I think this leads to is not only that we've got a growth in new innovation, but we've got inclusiveness in ownership. So more and more people are going to own parts of those companies, and they're also going to have the tools they need to build their own. And so we're getting to a more entrepreneurial economy, and one where we all own a little bit of the pie, instead of it being ownership focused in only a small percentage of the population and everyone works for a wage. So socially, this is a big area of growth also. Now, when we look at regulation, you'll see a big criticism of the ESG movement is the lack of standardization in ESG and of regulations, but that's starting to come together. I mean, this could be a spaghetti diagram here with all of these different logos, but what we see is that governments around the world and reporting agencies and organizations are starting to really figure out how to do this in the same way so that we compare apples to apples across the world and really get to not only consistent measurement and reporting, but ones that are accurately going to report what we actually need to know. And so we'll have less greenwashing. Now, this is just a little bit about scopes. You probably hear these all the time, but your scope 1 emissions, this is the fuel that you've actually used and what you're doing on site. So if you've got a factory, what are the emissions that come from your actual work in the factory? Scope 2, what are those indirect emissions? Things like the energy that you use to create those products. And how do you actually power that factory? And then scope 3, this is where the vast majority of emissions come from. And this is from the supply chain. And then this is from downstream. This is the customers actually using the good or service. So if we think about this in terms of a car, this is buying all of these parts from so many different manufacturers, and then you're actually giving the customer a product which they're out driving around, and the vast majority of the emissions come from that use. With EVs, that's different. There's a larger footprint for manufacturing, but a much lower footprint for the actual use of the vehicle. Excuse me. And so this is important to think about, especially for companies that are looking to cut their emissions. A lot of them are focusing on the scope 1 and 2, excuse me. But what I've seen across the board is that companies are starting to think about, how do we get our scope 3 emissions down? And the big companies are looking at their suppliers and saying, I'm going to start making decisions, not just about price and not just about quality and not just about safety, but I'm going to start making decisions based on sustainability. So you're going to need to give me a report that shows me how sustainable your product is, and 2, what you're doing to become more sustainable. And there's a plethora of new reporting platforms and software and companies sprouting up to support this, to make this easier. Because right now it's a really heavy lift and it's really difficult, to be brutally honest. These companies are having a really hard time, but at least they're starting to focus on it and they're putting their weight behind it. So imagine what happened with a company like Walmart, putting its weight behind prices. And a lot of their suppliers had to reduce their prices just to have their products on their shelves. So they had to innovate and find new ways of supplying lower cost goods. Sometimes that was unethical because they just looked for lower cost labor that had less labor restrictions, for example. Obviously, we can't do that. In this case, these big companies are going to use their leverage to get more sustainable products and services. So tons of momentum in this space. And if you're at a company that's looking at how you get there, I think this is a really helpful framework to think about. So this is from PwC. It's the sustainability maturity path. So when we think about sustainability, often people think about this compliance piece and obligations maybe. And that's just the first part of it. What do we need to do to just reduce our risk? We want to stay within the regulatory framework and we don't want to get fined. But as you move up that and you see what you're obligated and expected to do by your customers, with number 2, these are things like companies that are afraid of social media, as they should be. A company's brand value can disappear overnight with a tweet and with a social media campaign. And so they're not only afraid of being found out for doing something unsustainable, they're afraid of even being accused of it. And so this leads from something called greenwashing, which I'm sure we've all heard of, the inaccurate and unethical reporting of doing something sustainable when you're not, to something called green hushing. So with green hushing, these companies are actually not talking about the progress that they're making and not talking about the projects they're working on because they're afraid that people might think that they are greenwashing. So as we move up this, number 3, we start looking at efficiency. How can we save money? How can we find cost reductions in our supply chain or otherwise? And then this is where it really starts to get interesting, is when we look at leadership and long-term viability, and then creating new value. How can we actually create new companies, new value that's going to go out and address the social and climate challenges, but also do it in a way that is more abundant? And this is another way of looking at it, moving from what was essentially greenwashing in the past through risk reductions, efficiencies, and cost reductions into new business. And this is about building in blue oceans, where there's less competition, there's more opportunity. And these are ways where we've got the complementary combination of these different aspects. Okay. So we've only got a few minutes left. So I want to talk a little bit about where might this be heading and how can we direct it down a better path. So some people think that the only way to achieve sustainability is through austerity. And I don't think that's going to work. I think that even seeing a slight reduction in living standards or even the perception of it, people will not accept it. And that's kind of their right. One way or the other leads to social instability, and that's not sustainable one way or the other. Another future that we hear about is incredible, a dirty world, and in a place that's heavily polluted with collapsing ecosystems because our economy takes the lead in priority, but the ecology that it operates within doesn't get a seat at the table. So I think that the only path forward, the only viable path forward we have is sustainable abundance. It really is through creating more abundance more sustainably. And that doesn't mean that everyone has to have, 5 cars and a giant house. It means resource productivity and using the resources that we have in a way that is more sustainable, and in a way that we can do things like use the sharing economy to leverage our cars, for example. The average car is parked for 24 hours or 23 hours a day, excuse me. And so people are only out driving a small portion of the time. Once we get things like autonomous vehicles and we can take our car home and then send it out to drive others around, like Uber does today or Lyft does today, driverless, then that one is much cheaper for the rider. Instead of paying, several dollars a mile, they're paying 60 to 70 cents per mile. So hugely reduced cost of transportation. And then two, it's much more effective use of those resources. So you're seeing many teenagers today who say, I don't even want a driver's license, I don't need a car, because they use Uber and Lyft. That's just going to get cheaper and cheaper. And people talk about autonomous vehicles being years out. I was just in San Francisco 2 weeks ago, and GM Cruise is already providing autonomous rides throughout San Francisco. So just like Uber, you can download an app and you can take a ride in a car with no driver. And it's totally legal and seems pretty safe and is working great. They haven't really had any issues. So, sure, is it 1 year out? Is it 5 years out? I don't know. Could be 10, but it's getting there, and it's getting there quickly. So as all of these technologies and all of these solutions converge, I think what we're seeing is clean energy that comes into the system and then is used to automate a lot of the manufacturing and a lot of the transportation and a lot of the different needs that we have, and doing so with renewable energy, sharing those resources for better resource efficiency, and then democratizing ownership as well. And so what does that end up doing? There's this really interesting concept called the Zero Marginal Cost Society. There's a great book under that name by Jeremy Rifkin. And what this cycle looks like is taking that renewable energy, having it power robotic and automated manufacturing and maintenance of the equipment, and then pulling all kinds of data and insights, leveraging artificial intelligence to improve that cycle, make it work better. And then automating a lot of smart contracts. So we're seeing this not only with ChatGPT, but with what's called Auto GPT now. And so I used to call these autonomous economic agents. And these are basically artificial intelligence agents that will go out and attain a goal for you. So you can say, hey, I want a haircut that's which I need soon. I need a haircut that is low priced, high quality, and somewhere nearby. And it will go out and look for that for you and can book a haircut for you. That's one of the easiest ways of doing it. But it can also, at this point, say, hey, I want you to run my Amazon store in a way that is going to acquire more sustainable goods and acquire them for cheaper and run a marketing campaign for me. So not quite there, but that's where it's going. And so once we have that, everybody's much more empowered with not only a digital assistant like we have with Siri, but with a digital intern that can actually go out and take some action for us. And then we're sharing much more of our physical wealth. And that leads to these business models where with physical goods, they get more expensive as you scale. With sharing, it kind of levels off at a certain point because only a certain number of people can use it. And then with digital goods, it just gets cheaper and cheaper. So this is the zero marginal cost concept. So it costs about the same to provide a software product to one person as it does to a million. So as that gets shared, it becomes much more abundant and available for everyone. And so as that renewable energy is fueling the system, and the automated processes are not only manufacturing things, but remanufacturing them in a circular economy, we can really lead ourselves to this world of a really abundant and sustainable and participatory economy where we all have a part in it and we all get to share in the abundance. So I think that's where we should go and where I think the world might be heading. So one thing I do in the book, and I'll just go through this real quickly, is the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We all remember this from Psychology 101. But what if we applied this to society? And what would a society look like if it had its hierarchy of needs met? Well, first, it would have the physiological infrastructure that we need. And a lot of this is in place in most developed countries and cities, but the physical infrastructure and the services that we need, but also to do things like eliminate poverty and homelessness and provide energy and transportation that's readily available. We talked about how that's going to be cheaper and more abundant. And then we look at public health and physical safety. So how do we meet the safety needs of society in addition to the individuals? And by providing it to all the individuals, we get to a society. And so this is an envisioning exercise of how we might envision what a sustainable and equitable future might look like. The Surgeon General in the United States just declared an epidemic of loneliness in America. And I think this is true across most developed countries. And so really focusing in on what does it mean to belong and be part of a community and to not only have friendships, but really belonging. And so there's a lot of ways we can look at that from a policy perspective, from a community perspective, and from how business can play a role as well. Self-esteem. What might the world look like if we met the esteem needs of everyone in our society with the potential for post-scarcity and egalitarian access to education, the ability to be entrepreneurial and or pursue whatever ambitions you have, whether they're athletic or intellectual or community. To be able to meet that would be wonderful. And then self-actualization. So it's not just about post-scarcity, but what about post-discontent? If we lived in an abundant world, that doesn't mean everyone's just going to be happy magically and automatically. It means that we need to focus on ourselves and what it means to be a human being. And that's going to play a big role in how we get to a sustainable future and addressing the needs of people so that they are on board. And so to close it off, this is what leads to what I call an Omni-Thriving Society. So when we think about our bodies as an organism of many different organs and organisms, trillions of little single cellular organisms, but our liver is not in competition with our lungs for survival. Our heart is not, engaged in a Calvin struggle for survival with the brain. Instead, these organs all thrive better when all the other organs around them are doing their best. And that's also true of the human societal organism. We look at areas that have immense inequality or big differences in health outcomes or educational outcomes. They don't actually thrive that well as a whole, but ones where people's needs are being met and the social organism is the healthiest in all directions are overall the healthiest societies that we see. So this is the world that I think we can build, and it's the world that we're advancing towards, and the world that everyone in this room has a role to play in being a part of and has a big opportunity in being a part of. So thank you for being a part of it and for doing the work that you do to get us to that future. So if you're interested in learning more, check out my book, What Could Go Right. I've been grateful to have received a couple of awards for it recently, which has been fantastic. So also you can find me on LinkedIn and Twitter and all of the above. So thank you again to the CEP conference, Mike and everyone there for having me be a part of this. And I hope you all have a wonderful conference. Thank you so much. And I think we'll take some questions.
Brilliant. Thank you, Justin. I shall get my digital intern to order me a copy of that up right away. And it is amazing what they can do. So I'm happy to take questions from the floor or through the app as well. Who's got one? And apologies for the screen on the far side. We're going to sort that out. So who's got a question? I know people have. There we go. Down the back. If you just state your name and affiliation.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Yvonne Gilmore. I'm a consultant. Within your model, is there any investigation on maximum population numbers for the planet?
Hey, Yvonne, thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, there's a lot of models that show the human population sort of evening out around 10 billion, maybe 11. What we're seeing in all these developed countries is that the birth rates drop rather dramatically. And so Japan is actually having a crisis. China's looking at a crisis of population where we thought, China was going to have a even bigger population explosion. But what they're worried about now is collapse of population. And so the US and Europe are similar, but the US has a lot of immigration, and that's really the only thing keeping America over 2% or two-child replacement rate for the population. And so I think it's important to think about how things will grow in the coming decades, but also we need to think about what we're going to do in economies where they're actually shrinking and where the populations are getting smaller, because for some reason, when people get richer, they want fewer children. Maybe this is because they don't want 10 kids to go and, work the farm for them anymore. Maybe it's because they'd rather spend their time, sipping martinis on Sundays or something like that. There's more wealth to enjoy. And I don't want to dismiss it, because children and continuing the population will happen, and it's really important. And so we need to take that into account, but we also need to take into account the fact that population or birth rates are declining across most developed countries and will soon decline in places that are developing today.
Further questions? Hands? Oh, just up the back. Is there a mic up the back? There is. Mike has the mic.
Not left.
Mike on the mic.
Hi, trying to frame this question. What I thought was very interesting is, first of all, the optimism, but you also talked about the perception gap, what people perceive to be the problem or what they are. Other than telling someone to go buy your book, if you're on a street corner trying to have that conversation with someone on the street, how do you frame it to get them to switch their thinking, for them to see less about the fear, more about the optimism? What's the elevator pitch to someone on the street?
Yeah, I think it's important not to dismiss their fears or their perceptions and try to understand why they believe what they believe. I was a part of I built a website called Spectrum Report back in the day. And what it did was it looked at news reports from the right in the US and from the left. And one of the scariest things I heard in 2016 when we had a shift in our politics, I'll just say that, was that people were saying, I don't know what world these people are living in. And I think that's actually the most dangerous thing about what you're asking, right? Is that people's perceptions are not only different from reality, but so different from each other. And so when I do talk to someone on the street and they bring the skeptical arguments to me, I listen. And I validate what I believe is right about what they're saying. If there is something there or something that's similar, then I can validate that and say, yes, electric vehicles take more carbon to create. That is totally true. The tires actually create more particulate matter because of the torque of the engine. That's true too. But over the lifetime, they are dramatically low. They have dramatically lower emissions than gas-powered cars, even in countries that don't have super high levels of renewable energy fueling the grid. And so I think that's a big part of it, is being able to listen to each other, being able to understand where someone's coming from, and try to validate what it is that they believe and why they believe it, before just reflexively jumping into, here's why you're wrong and here's a bunch of data points to support that, which eventually comes. But I think it's got to be a secondary part.
Brilliant. I've got one actually here from Andreas. In 90 seconds, Justin, how do you believe, or how do you balance maintaining a competitive advantage with sharing of sustainable business knowledge? So privacy and profit versus open collaboration and sustainable business.
Yeah, I think it's an and, not an or. So there are community or there are industry organizations where you can share some knowledge, but actually there are great ways of using the knowledge that you have and the IP that you have to succeed. And if you are successful, that's great. And then you've got people like Elon Musk who open sourced the patents from Tesla. And so that, I think, was a personal decision and partly a business decision. So he saw that for Tesla to be successful, there had to be more EVs in the world and there had to be more options. And we're seeing that becoming a really smart decision because he now has invested in all of the charging networks across the US and other countries. And what he's able to do now is to rent those charging stations to other companies. We're seeing lots of deals coming through with other car manufacturers that now are behind on charging infrastructure and their drivers won't have anywhere to charge if they don't use Tesla. And so it was actually a really smart business decision to say, I'm going to open source these patents so that others can build more electric vehicles because, you know, my game is much larger. And so that's one way to think about it is what is the goal that you're trying to achieve? And don't get so caught in the specific product or the specific service or SKU that you're selling. And how can your strategy play into that larger picture and longer term?
Brilliant. It will need to be a very quick question and a wonderfully succinct answer. Mike's going to hold
Try my best.
Stable Diffusion or DALI?
Which did you use?
Dolly for this one.
That was excellent. Hey, what about a round of applause for Justin Bean? What a great way to start the conference.
Thank you so much for having me, everybody. Appreciate it. Have a great conference.